Good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Pilot. I'm the Assistant Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I want to extend a warm December welcome to our viewers from around the world. I am so pleased that you are joining us for our program today, Eternal Austen, 250 Years of Loving Jane. Please note, this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's Vodcast library in a week or so. We received many questions in advance of the program that have been shared with our speaker. If you have a question during the presentation, you may enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, I will take a moment to introduce our faculty speaker. Professor Cristina Griffin is an assistant professor of English at the University of Virginia, where she specializes in 19th century literature, the history of the novel, gender and sexuality studies, and literature pedagogy. She is also managing director of UVA's Center for the Liberal Arts, which provides professional development for K-12 teachers. Her publications have appeared in 19th century scholarly journals, as well as Norton anthologies and Oxford handbooks. She also leads 3 public humanities initiatives: Teaching Literature for Liberation, a nationwide resource for K-12 English language arts and social studies teachers; Who's Reading, an initiative to enable university students to read better and to empower faculty to help them do so; and Project Gothic, a digital companion to the world's largest archive of Gothic fiction, which is housed in UVA's special collections. Professor Griffin, I invite you to begin your presentation today.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Althea, as well, for inviting me to talk with you all today. I absolutely love doing lifetime learning events. I love talking about Jane Austen. I suspect some of you also love Jane Austen, and that's why you're here. If you are here because you are simply Austen curious, then perhaps this talk and our discussion afterwards will convince you to dip a toe into her world, which of course is grounded in her life and in her novels, but over the past 250 years has grown to be much, much bigger. So today I am going to be thinking with you all together about what it means to love Austen, to love Jane, to love Jane Austen. I say those names in triplicate there, and I separate Jane from Austen in this talk's title because I want to take really seriously who it is we are loving when we talk about loving Jane Austen. Are we loving Jane the woman? Are we loving Austen the author? Are we loving Jane Austen or some entirely other creature that we've created ourselves? And I also want to take really seriously and think through the act of literary love. What does it mean to love an author or a set of books as an academic or a scholarly experience, as a personal readerly experience? Yeah, so that is what we are going to think through today. I have structured this talk as a tour of sorts of a variety of figures who loved Jane Austen throughout her life and beyond over the past 250 years. So we're going to work through each of these figures to help us think about what does it mean to love Jane Austen. And in particular, because we're having this conversation about Jane Austen, what does it mean to love a figure who, in many ways, did not really want to be publicly known? So that's what we're going to tackle today. To begin, the first person we need to talk about is part of Austen's family. So I'd like to begin with the first people who love Jane Austen. And if you know any name of any of Jane's family members, then you know the name Cassandra Austen, her older sister. Jane and Cassandra were 2 sisters in a sea of boys. When Jane Austen was born in 1775, she was born into a large family. There were 8 kids total. She was number 7 of 8. 6 boys, two girls. Cassandra was Jane's just slightly older sister. She's 3 years older. And they were really two girls in a sea of sons. They grew up as best friends and confidants and roommates, lived together their entire lives. They were incredibly close. They lived in a small circular area of England, a small little circle of England um, that we'll trace together. Okay, the first place they lived was Steventon. This is where Jane Austen was born in 1775, lived the first 26 years of her life with her family, all those brothers, her mother and father. Her father, George Austen, was the rector here, which means he was a member of he was a clergyman in the Church of England, and he served the parishes in this area. This is also the location where Jane Austen drafted the first three novels in the 1790s in her 20s. Then they moved to Bath, which was a spa town then and now, lived there for 5 years. About a year before they left Bath, their father died. The brothers had kind of dispersed to the surrounding area by this point. This was Jane and Cassandra living together with their mother and father. Their father passed away. And they moved shortly thereafter to Southampton, where one of the brothers lived, Francis, who they called Frank. Southampton was and is a naval seaside city. They moved to where Frank and his wife Mary were living, lived there for 3 years, and then finally moved to Chawton, where Jane Austen spent the last 8 years of her life. This is where she revised those first three novels, wrote three more. It's where her publishing career happened, where she was living when her publishing career happened. And Cassandra lived with her in every single one of these places. They were roommates and frequently bedmates, because when you have 8 children, you don't necessarily have bedrooms for all of them. I mentioned that they lived in kind of you could just draw a small circle on this corner of England, and that's where she lived. And she didn't travel much outside it. They did visit family and friends a decent amount, but it was all mostly in this area. If you were to drive today from Steventon, where Austen started her life at that topmost star, to the middle star, Chawton, where she lived at the end of her life, it would take you about 30 minutes today. So just to kind of put in perspective the small geographical space that Austen inhabited. As I said, Cassandra and Jane were as close can be. Jane Austen, if you were to do the math on these dates, died when she was 41. So she was born in December 16th of 1775. She died in July of 1817. That's how that math works out. She was 41 years old, and so quite young. And Cassandra was understandably distraught. She wrote to their niece a couple days after her sister's death, "I have lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend, as can never have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I had not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself." Jane is obviously the writer of the Austen family, but I think Cassandra shows here that she also has quite the way with words. Jane, from early on as a writer, found her artist pair in her sister Cassandra. So this is one of Jane Austen's early writings. She wrote this piece called The History of England with a nice wry little subtitle, or really long subtitle actually, by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. She wrote this when she was about 16 years old. It's a quite funny piece. She's very self-aware, already developing that like iconically ironic, witty voice as a teenager. And the small images that you see here of different royal figures in the history of England were done by Cassandra. So she was, at times, her sister's illustrator. There are only two portraits that we know unequivocally are of Jane Austen, and they are both done by Cassandra. And these are them. The first portrait here, the blue dress watercolor, was done by Cassandra somewhere around 1804. This would have been when they were living in Bath. Austen would have been just shy of 30. In the second and, you know, we could see her a little bit better. Portrait in pencil and watercolor. They would have been living in Chawton. She would have been just on the precipice of beginning to publish. So both of these are actually really of Jane before she becomes Jane Austen, the author, many years before she becomes publicly known as Jane Austen, the author, but these are both before she begins publishing, not before she begins writing, but before she begins publishing. If there is one thing that is fairly apparent to me when I look at these portraits, it is that Jane, as her sister has represented her, does not look like a woman who will easily give up her secrets. She looks like someone who is going to keep things close. In the blue dress picture, we can't even see her face. In the pencil and watercolor sketch, um, she's a touch standoffish. And, she has every right to be. Um, Jane and Cassandra, as I said, lived together their whole lives. They were roommates, often bedfellows, their whole lives. When they weren't together, they were writing letters to one another. I frequently tell my students that Jane and Cassandra wrote letters to one another like we text today, right? It was constant. If they weren't together, they were writing to one another. And if they weren't writing to one another, they were writing, and Jane especially was writing to other close friends and family. So she was writing a lot of letters. This is one of the letters that we have from Jane to Cassandra. This was written while they were both living in Southampton, and Jane was visiting some family friends in Canterbury, and she wrote this letter to Cassandra. I picked this one and made it as big as possible because I wanted to let you all see the very interesting way this is written. This is what's called a crossed letter. So which, as I was talking to my daughters about Jane Austen last night, and I was showing them some of these images, they said that is impossible to read. And they're not wrong. It is very difficult to read. You really have to train yourself to be able to read a letter like this, where you are writing in one direction and then turning the paper 90 degrees and writing some more. This was a decently common practice in the 19th century because it was a way to save paper. It is also just a really tangible physical reminder that Jane did not run out of things to say to her older sister, right? She always had more to say. If Cassandra is famous for one thing, it is, and I suspect many of you know what I'm going to say, it is that she burned the vast majority of her sister's letters. Cassandra, shortly before her own death in the mid-1840s, so she long outlived her sister, destroyed nearly all of Jane's correspondence. And there is not one clear answer as to why. We estimate that Jane probably wrote at least or upwards of 3,000 letters, thousands of letters. There are 161 letters available today. That is about 5% of what we think she probably wrote, and we might be underestimating. If someone told you that they were going to try and recreate your interior life based on 5% of your personal text messages or 5% of your personal emails, we might say that that is absolutely preposterous. That would not be an accurate full picture of a human's interior life, right? 5%, that's so small. And yet, that is what we are left with, and that is what we as scholars or readers or lovers of Jane Austen are frequently trying to do. There are many scholars who really regret that Cassandra burned these letters. And I understand that. Of course, it would feel like a huge boon to understand this woman better. And yet, I honestly can't bring myself to regret Cassandra's actions because this is the Jane that Cassandra tells us she knew as a sister. And she seems reserved and like she appreciates her private life. And we know from her letters that do survive that she is reserved and appreciates her private life. And who am I to question her older sister's protective act? So I also think, and we'll talk about this a little later in the talk, and I'm sure maybe in the Q&A as well, that this act of burning Austen's letters also is part of what enables Jane to remain so enchanting to us, right? This wide unknown, this almost known, but this just out of reach ness of these letters we can never get back is also, I think, what makes her such an important and enchanting figure. Okay, well, I could talk about Cassandra Austen all day, but there are many other folks that I would like to get to. So the next person I want to talk about is someone who gets almost no airtime when talking about Jane Austen's life, but really played was near equal to Cassandra in terms of closeness to Jane Austen, and that is a woman named Martha Lloyd. So Martha Lloyd was Austen and or Jane and Cassandra. She was the Austens' friend from childhood. She was a neighbor. She was a confidant their whole lives. She and Jane and Cassandra were really a trio. The three of them were very close. Jane refers to Martha as a sister in some of her letters. Very few people knew that Jane Austen was writing and publishing. And certainly very few people outside the family knew that she was writing and publishing while it was happening. But Martha did know. Martha knew about Jane's literary endeavors, and that alone tells us how close they were. Martha also lived with Jane and Cassandra for the last like dozen years of Jane's life. So after their father died in Bath in 1805, Martha moved in with them. So it was Martha and Jane and Cassandra and Jane and Cassandra's mother, also named Cassandra. And the four of them lived together in Bath. And then when they moved to Southampton, where Brother Frank was living, Martha moved with them. And when they moved to Chawton, where Brother Edward had given his sisters and mother a cottage to live in, Martha moved with them. So Martha was really an integral part of Austen's life from the beginning, and particularly her adulthood. Um, Martha is also a reminder that community that I just described is also a reminder. And I think this is something very interestingly overlooked when we think about Austen's life, that Austen really spent a large portion of her adulthood living in a small, intimate circle of women, and particularly a small, intimate circle of single women, right? Her mother was widowed in 1805, never remarried. Her sister, Cassandra, was engaged in the 1790s, and then her fiance caught yellow fever and died while in the West Indies, and then she never married. Martha Lloyd did actually marry. She married the Austen brother Frank, who lived in Southampton. She was his second wife, but she didn't marry him until 10, 11 years after Austen's death. So she was single the whole time. And Jane Austen also never married. This was a little enclave of single women, and that was the environment in which Jane Austen experienced the majority of her adulthood and wrote her novels. So I mentioned that Jane Austen never married. As I've said, we don't know the vast majority of what there could be to know about Jane Austen's interior life. 95+% of her letters have disappeared. Who knows what love she experienced? We know from the surviving letters that she did have some flirtations. And we also know that she received one and only one that we know of proposal. It happened when she was 27 years old. She and Cassandra were visiting some family friends. And one of the family members, his name was Harris Bigwither, which is just the absolute most Dickensian name you've ever heard. Harris Bigwither. He was 21. Jane was 27. Harris proposed, and Jane Austen said yes. And then she went to bed that night. Who knows what happened? What did she and Cassandra talk about? What did she muse? What did she read? Who knows? But the next day, she woke up, she went back to Harris Bigwither and said, no, thank you. I am not going to marry you. There are two things I want us to take from the story that I think are really important. The first is her age. So I said she was 27. 27 was the age where a woman in the 19th century, particularly the early 19th century, really started to fully be considered a spinster or an old maid. Not my terms, 19th century terms, right? If you have read Pride and Prejudice, then you might be thinking of Charlotte Lucas, who receives a proposal from the preposterous Mr. Collins at the ripe old age of 27. And there's a real fear for Charlotte in that novel that she will never receive another proposal. And she, out of desperation, has to take this one, right? If you've read Persuasion, you might think about Anne Elliot's second chance romance with Captain Wentworth. That also occurs when she is 27. 27 was an age for women that had cultural significance like 35 or 40 does today, right? It was a bit of a crossing of the Rubicon. So that means Jane Austen received a proposal at the age of 27, said yes, and then said no, most likely knowing that she was probably not going to receive another proposal during her lifetime, right? That the odds were going way, way down. And that brings me to the second reason I think the story matters so much, which is that Jane chose singleness. My daughter's last night said to me she was single and proud. And I don't know if Austen would have, used exactly that phrase, but my kids are right. She was. She chose her singleness, right? She had the option not to be. She had the option of marriage. The fact that she said yes and then said no really emphasizes that this was a choice, right? It was absolutely a choice. And maybe not something we need to like bemoan, right? I think Jane Austen lived a pretty happy life in many ways in this intimate enclave of women. She does not seem to have regretted her choice, and it does seem to have been a life that was absolutely filled with love. Okay, so far I've only been talking about the women, primarily who loved Jane Austen. Who knows if Harris Bigwither loved Jane Austen? We don't know enough about him to know. But there were, of course, men, many men who have loved Jane Austen over the years. And I would like to introduce you to one named Henry Austen. This is Jane's brother. He is number four of the 8 siblings, the third brother. Henry Austen was absolutely beloved by Jane. She writes about him delightedly in her letters. He eventually married one of her other close friends, Eliza. And Henry Austen is important. The reason I'm really talking about him today, right now, is because Henry Austen was integral in facilitating the publication of Austen's novels. So Austen published 6 novels in a swift 7-year period. The first 4 while she was still alive, the last 2 came out posthumously. Her first novel to come out was Sense and Sensibility in 1811. And as you can see from the title page of the first edition that I have here, it was the byline on it is by a lady. So Austen, somewhat well known that she published anonymously during her lifetime, which was not uncommon for women, although it's worth saying plenty of women also published under their names. She's also not hiding her gender here, right? She says by a lady. There were also plenty of men publishing anonymously at the time, including the most famous author of the 18 teens and 20s, Sir Walter Scott, who was publishing anonymously at the same time as Austen. So she published Sense and Sensibility in 1811. Then she's got 3 more novels that come out in quick succession: Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma in 1813, 14, and 15. Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Mansfield Park were all published with the publisher Thomas Egerton. You can see T. Egerton Whitehall listed down just above the date on this title page. The reason I'm mentioning this is that Thomas Egerton mostly published military books. The reason this happened, we think, is because Henry had a military career, and he was what we might kind of think of as like holding a little bit of the role of like literary agent. I hesitate to totally call him that because that makes it sound like maybe Austen was like completely passive and like he was the agent. And it really wasn't like that. It was much more of a collaborative process, but he certainly was helping her to find her foothold in the publishing world. And that is how the first 3 novels ended up with Thomas Egerton, we believe. When Emma came about at the end of 1815, that was published by John Murray, but that was also negotiated in large part by Henry. Henry also helped Austen to figure out like whether she was going to hold the copyright or it was going to be held by the publishers, things like that. So he was very, very important for all of this. Sense and Sensibility was published by a lady. Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma were all published as by the author of one of the previous novels. So Pride and Prejudice was by the author of Sense and Sensibility, and Emma was by the author of Pride and Prejudice, etc. When Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published in 1818, remember Austen died in 1817, so both of these come out posthumously. They came out together in one collection. Northanger, well, they're actually both pretty short. The publication and putting together of this edition of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion was facilitated by Henry alongside Cassandra. So again, these are her siblings, who knew her intimately as Jane, but also are facilitating her authorship, right? They don't just know about her writing, but are helping to facilitate it and make it happen and make it public. When Northanger Abbey and Persuasion come out, that is also when that edition acknowledges Jane Austen as the author. So she is finally acknowledged as the author, named as the author in that edition put together by her brother and sister. So they also they begin the narrative of who gets to be Austen, right? Who gets to be Jane Austen, putting her name on this. I would like to walk through two male readers who were alive at the same time as Jane Austen, absolutely loved and appreciated her writing, and also both happened to be extraordinarily famous. Certainly much more famous than Austen was during her lifetime. The first one, is the Prince Regent. So the Prince Regent was acting King of England from 1811 to 1820, while his father, King George III, was dealing with a variety of mental illnesses and deemed incapable of ruling. So George became Prince Regent and served in that role until his father died in 1820, and then he became King George IV. So his reign as regent here, almost exactly is the envelope to Austen's publication history, right? 1811 to the end of that decade. Jane Austen did not like this man. Jane Austen did not like this man. Jane Austen likes manners and good taste, and the Prince Regent was not known for either. She wrote in a letter to that friend, Martha Lloyd, that we were talking about. Jane Austen wrote a letter talking about the Princess of Wales, Caroline, who was his wife, and she says, "I hate her husband." So she does not mince words. She did not like the Prince Regent, but the Prince Regent loved Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park. He thought these novels were exceptional. He did not know Jane. He did not know that they were written by Jane Austen. He just knew they were by a lady and then, by the author of Sense and Sensibility, etc. He let it be known that he would like to have one of her novels dedicated to him. And so she begrudgingly did so. Here is the dedication page for Emma, where she writes, "To His Royal Highness the Prince Regent. This work is, by His Royal Highness's permission, most respectfully dedicated by His Royal Highness's dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author." I absolutely love everything about this dedication. If we remember back to the wry subtitle of her 16-year-old History of England, we can see it taking full force of irony, right, erupting in this dedication, right? That triplicate of Royal Highness, Royal Highness, Royal Highness, the over-the-topness shows us just how much she does not actually respect this man. That note, "by His Royal Highness's permission," is such a wonderful undercutting because it's not his permission, it was his insistence, right? The other thing that I quite love about this is that if you've read Emma, and Emma is my personal favorite of all of Austen's novels, I think it is her most complex, both character-wise and narratively, the way it's narrated. I absolutely love it. Emma is really about a woman, Emma, who is the monarch figure in her corner of England, right, in her society. And she is not a great ruler, right? She spends the majority of the novel not being a great leader, but by the end, she learns to be a good one. So there is some wonderful irony in Austen dedicating to the Prince Regent this novel about a leader who needs to learn to be a better one. She knows how to give a good dig. Jane Austen may have been beloved by the Prince Regent, in other words, but the feeling was not mutual. Our second reader that I want to mention is the author and critic Sir Walter Scott, who I've already said was really like the first, he was really the first like international best-selling writer, and he was certainly the most famous writer writing at the time. He was publishing in the same decade as Jane Austen, but he got to continue publishing for much longer because he lived longer. When I say here that he is author and critic, I don't mean that he is critical of Austen. I mean critic in the sense of like he wrote essays and reviews of literature. And he rather liked Austen's writing. Again, he did not know her during her lifetime as Jane Austen. He just knew her as, or he just knew her novels. When Emma came out, he wrote, "The subjects are not often elegant and certainly never grand, but they are finished up to nature and with a precision which delights the reader." That is high praise from Sir Walter Scott. After Northanger Abbey and Persuasion emerge, he writes again about her. At that point, he's talking about Jane Austen because her name has been revealed. It's a pretty big deal that the most famous writer of this time period read her as a contemporary, didn't know who she was, and valued her novels. And yet, it is also the case that after 1820, if nothing else had changed, Austen and her novels would have just slipped into a kind of mild oblivion. In the middle of the 19th century, not a ton of people are publishing her novels. Some people are reading them, but they're not flying off the shelves. No one's really writing a ton more reviews. She probably would have ended up being one of those forgotten female writers that in the 1970s or 80s, some scholar got to discover and say, oh, look, this is a woman who had a career before, and we've just kind of lost her to history. That is not what happened, of course. And we have one very important person to thank for that. So I want to take a moment and herald here. Of the people I've talked about so far, we've had Jane's sister, best friend, and brother, three people who knew Jane intimately and who also knew and nurtured Jane Austen, the author, right? We've had two men who were readers of her, the Prince Regent and Sir Walter Scott, who did not know Jane. Also aren't really like lamenting that they didn't know Jane. Like what they are valuing is the novels, and they didn't even know they were written by her until after she died. Now things start to get a bit complicated when we get to the last third of the 19th century. I would like you all to meet this man, James Edward Austen-Leigh. He was Jane Austen's nephew, son of her oldest brother. And he was also Jane's first biographer. So James Edward Austen-Leigh knew Aunt Jane in mostly his childhood and teens. He was 19 when she passed away. And in the later half of the 1860s, he started putting together a biography of his aunt, which was published first at the very end of 1869. It was called A Memoir of Jane Austen. He was very smart and made his byline by her nephew, J.E. Austen-Leigh. The man knew what he was doing, absolutely. This memoir was by no means a tell-all. It's been called like a ragbag kind of biography. It tells parts of the story, it leaves out huge swaths. It is a really select mix of things. But what it does is present this portrait of Jane Austen, who is a sweet, kind, quiet, proper sister and aunt who really loves her domestic life and does a bit of writing when she has the time. And Victorians absolutely ate this up. When it came out, they pulled it from the shelves. They read it in their circulating libraries. They wrote letters to James Edward Austen-Leigh asking more questions about Jane Austen. Just over a year later, a second edition is issued in 1871. That's one of the best ways to see, how well beloved a book was back in the day before you have Amazon tracking is like, how fast does the second edition come out? Second edition came out in 1871 with an appendix, including some of Austen's previously unpublished works, in this case, Lady Susan, her early novella. It was quite the sensation. I want you to note, and I'm going to make it bigger on the next slide, this image that's on the page facing the title page of the memoir, which was created specifically for this memoir. So we have a trio of portraits here. You'll remember this portrait of Cassandra Austen, done in pencil and watercolor in 1810. The middle portrait was one commissioned by Austen-Leigh. It's a watercolor by a man named Joseph Andrews, and it is based on that portrait by Cassandra Austen, right? So John Andrews never knew Jane Austen. He's looking at that portrait, creating his own watercolor version. And then very shortly after, a steel engraving was made to be printed in the memoir of Jane Austen. And that's the one that appears right there, right on that facing page, with Jane Austen written in kind of block letters underneath. There are a handful of things that kind of happen if you kind of compare beginning to end of these portraits. We might note a general softening of Jane, right? Fewer sharp edges, like literally, like fewer angles. Her slightly downturn mouth in the Cassandra sketch becomes slightly upturned in that steel engraving. Her crossed arms are now just sitting on her lap. Her slouch has been removed. She's a little less reserved, a little more welcoming, maybe a little friendlier, a little softer. My students like to point out that she also looks a little more put together with like her ruffled. That watercolor by Cassandra is Jane, right? That is Jane, the woman. That steel engraving that ends up on as the frontispiece to the memoir is Austen, the author, right? And they are not the same. They may have overlap, but they are not the same. And we really can see that transformation here. Interestingly, the steel engraving image that went on the memoir is the most frequently reprinted image of Austen ever since 1869, including in 2017, when the Bank of England issued a note with Jane Austen's face. They chose that one. The image for this talk was that image, and I think that's really fitting because like the Austen that is eternal is this Austen, right? It's not Jane. It's not Cassandra's Jane who is eternal. It is this slightly different, more elongated necked, softer Jane who has become eternal. Okay, we are going to talk about one more quick figure before we head into the 20th century, but he's really someone who kind of launches us into the 20th century, and that is a man named George Saintsbury. George Saintsbury was a scholar who put together an edition of Pride and Prejudice in 1894. So after this memoir came out and interest in Austen like reignited, publishers are putting out copies of Jane Austen, as fast as folks can pick them up and read them. This edition, which is frequently called the Peacock edition for obvious reasons, is quite lovely. It's also been put on a million things, including a tote bag, which I happen to have been given and now holds my embroidery. One of the great things about this edition is that George Saintsbury, in his introduction to Pride and Prejudice here, calls himself a Janite. That is a term that has stuck with us for the past 131 years since he wrote it, a Janite. And what he means by that is that he is a devotee of Jane Austen, but he doesn't say Austenite, right? He says Janite. He claims an intimacy, not just with her as author, but with her as woman, right? As person, as if she is someone he can know. And that term has really stuck around, right? A colleague and I recently wished one another happy birthday from one Janite to another, right? Like that term has stuck around. And yet, I also believe genuinely that Jane isn't someone that can be known. So that's a real interesting tension there. Okay, we are about to step into the 20th and 21st centuries, where if there was a dormancy for Austen in the mid-19th century, the 20th and 21st centuries really decided to make up for it. So let's move through a few figures or conglomerates, I guess, who have loved Jane Austen because these are not individuals. First, publishers. Publishers have absolutely loved Jane Austen for the past 130 years. This is an example of just a sampling of Pride and Prejudice covers from the past 130 years, starting with the Peacock edition. I really could have picked, myriads more here. The main thing I want to make clear with this collection is how not only do publishers love to print and reprint Jane Austen in general, Pride and Prejudice in particular, but each of these covers reminds us that these publishers make a real and I think it works effort to make Jane Austen their own, like of their own time, right? So that 1940s movie tie-in cover, that 1960s cover, they're so incredible. I bet if I didn't have the dates here, you would be able to guess what decade they were from. So publishers have really loved Austen, and she's spent the past 100 years in the public domain, so she's extra beloved. Filmmakers have also really loved Austen. There are no shortages of adaptations, particularly from the past 30 years. I have put my four favorites, or four of my favorites here. I think the only Sense and Sensibility to watch is Ang Lee's and Emma Thompson's. It's phenomenal. I love teaching it. Emma Thompson is a genius rewriter of Jane Austen. Clueless is, hands down, in my opinion, the best adaptation of Emma. Of course, the mid-90s BBC miniseries Pride and Prejudice deserves an important place here. It is the most faithful adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, with the exception of Colin Firth jumping into the lake. But, many of us have tried to try and figure out why they did that, and we can talk about it in Q&A if you want. And then my personal favorite Pride and Prejudice adaptation, which is Bride and Prejudice. One thing I will mention here before I move on to the next one is that when we talk about cinematic novelists, we frequently talk about novelists who can kind of like sweep across atmosphere and setting and really detail a scene. That is not Jane Austen. Jane Austen is a less externalized writer. And so it is actually very interesting that she is so beloved by film. If you have ever spent any time on Etsy, where small shops meet their ideal customers, you will find lots and lots of Jane Austen merch, candles, and all sorts of tea accoutrement, trinkets of all kinds, from ornaments to pins to bookmarks to keychains to Mr. Knightley's quotable pencils. Perhaps you need a sweatshirt extolling the virtues of excellent boiled potatoes, or perhaps your child needs some pajamas or a scarf with the entirety of Captain Wentworth's letter on it. All of these things are available, right? Because Etsy shop owners love Jane Austen. And the last group that I want to mention love Jane Austen are novelists. Novelists and writers, of course, love Jane Austen. We might think of that in the more specific realm of like folks who have written about and whose careers have been based on, or some of their writings have been based on Jane Austen, right? So like Austen retellings of her life, right? So Becoming Jane Austen, which turned into the Anne Hathaway movie Becoming Jane, Jill Hornby's Miss Austen, which is now the miniseries just recently out. Or we might think about novels that think about the experience of reading Jane Austen, Austen-Land, the Jane Austen Society, Jane Austen Ruined My Life. There are so many more, all about what does it mean to read, to be a reader of Jane Austen. We might think about the historical adaptations that are indebted to Jane Austen, the mystery novel, Death Comes to Pemberley, the servant's perspective of Pride and Prejudice, that is Longbourn, and the absolutely fantastic adaptation, The Other Bennet Sister, a relatively recent publication by Janice Hadlow, which is Mary Bennet's story. Or we might think about the contemporary offerings and retellings, Unmarriageable, Pride, and Ayesha, which all take place in a contemporary moment in three very different locales: Pakistan, Afro-Latinx in Brooklyn, a Muslim community in Toronto, and think about the retellings that would manifest of Austen. But that's actually not what I'm thinking about here. What I'm thinking about is every single novelist who has written a book since 1818. We are all indebted as readers of any book published after 1818 to Jane Austen. And whether or not novelists today, or really since 1818, want to admit that they love Jane Austen, they are all indebted to her. And that is for many reasons, but the one that is most important to me that I want to end on is this concept, this narrative technique that Jane Austen perfected called free indirect discourse. Free indirect discourse, or FID, F-I-D, FID. When I teach Austen, exploring free and direct discourse is like one of the top three learning objectives. So we spend an entire semester on this. So you're going to get the 90-second version. But free and direct discourse is an incredibly important narrative technique where a third person, omniscient style narrator like Austen's ventriloquizes the particular and individual internal mental language of a character. So it's when a narrator can kind of like step into the consciousness of a character, not by quoting them, not by tagging and saying, Lizzie thought, or something like that, but just seamlessly entering the consciousness of a character, representing their thoughts, embodying their thoughts, ventriloquizing their thoughts, and then stepping back out. If you have read a novel that was published since 1818, then you have read free and direct discourse because it is now just part of the way that third person omniscient novels are written. We can take it for granted now, but it was not taken for granted in the 18 teens. Jane Austen was developing and perfecting it. You can see it from her first novels to her last one. It gets more and more complex and sophisticated. It is phenomenal. Free and direct discourse is also something that only happens in fiction, right? We cannot free and direct discourse one another's minds, right? I cannot free and direct discourse and step into your consciousness and then step out of it, right? Free and direct discourse is a privilege of fiction. The fact that we cannot free and direct discourse Jane Austen's mind, we cannot free and direct discourse Jane, is a reminder that Jane, the woman, is not a character, right? She is a real person. And the only opportunities we might have to do something like that with a real person might be letters or diary entries, and Cassandra removed that possibility for us, right? So I want to end then with 2 points. The first is that I think that this unknowability of Jane, right? Our inability to free and direct discourse with her because she's not a character, she's a person. Her relatively early death and the short number of novels published as a result, the burning of the vast majority of her letters, right? All of that reminds us of our inability to know the real Jane Austen. And that is a huge part, as I mentioned earlier, of what makes her so enchanting. All of those empty spaces invite us to find our place, to experience a kind of author-reader alchemy that is quite unique to Austen. I put a box like this on every slide where I introduced another figure who loved Jane Austen. And I have deliberately left it with an opening here because I think it is a representation of the fact that these empty spaces in some ways invite us in, right? They invite us to inhabit Austen's world, her novels, her life, that 95% that we can never recreate. And yet, once we're inside, she's also going to keep us at arm's length, right? She would not even show us her face, right? Like in this portrait. And then my second and final point related to that is that loving Jane really then means loving a real person that we cannot know. And loving Jane Austen means loving a fictionalization of that real person that we can only pretend to know. And ultimately, I am quite happy to do both. I will end there and invite John back.
Thanks for inviting me back, Professor Griffin. That was an amazing presentation. We have time for a couple of questions, and we got a few questions about trying to glean insights into Jane Austen. So I'll ask you two of those if you don't
Sure,
mind.
of course.
Um, you talk about the difficulty of it. To what extent can her novels help supplement this
Sure.
insight?
Sure. Um, I would say maybe a little or maybe a lot. Who knows? I mean, of course, so much of fiction can reflect our, the real lives, and we see for authors in the 19th century where we do have a lot of their letters or journal entries, you can do kind of that like tracing and placing where you say like, oh, this George Eliot experience turned into this thing in Mill on the Floss, and like that is real and also different. Maybe there are versions of that in Jane Austen. And there are characters who, in some of her letters, folks, she and some of the folks that know about her writing are like, oh, like people might recognize some of the neighbors in our town and whatnot. So, like, certainly certain things are drawn from life. I don't know. Maybe she had a huge romance and that inspired some of them, but all the letters were burned and we'll just never know. Or maybe she was never even kissed. I don't know. And also, I don't think Jane wants me to know. So, so I think I just had to accept that.
That's a fair point, and it kind of reminds me of one of the other questions we got. Is it possible you think that her sister Cassandra asked her to burn these letters?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is absolutely a possibility that Jane asked Cassandra to burn the letters, specifically, or that she asked her to like preserve her legacy, kind of more abstractly. I don't know if this is just because I'm an older sister, but I feel for Cassandra. I think even scholars who um, even scholars who lament the loss of the letters, most of us all agree that it was a protective instinct, right? Like, no one really thinks that Cassandra did it like maliciously. I think everyone knows it was an act of love. It would be a real turning of this narrative on its head if it was actually a malicious act. Um, but so yeah, I think it's absolutely possible that Jane asked her to do it. We'll just never know.
Yeah. One of the things that most intrigued me about your talk was that you mentioned that Austen inhabited this small circle of women.
Yeah.
Why do you think that she never created a female character who was a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, she has female characters who are readers, although funnily enough, sometimes the readers of novels in her books are lauded for their reading, like Lizzie is in Pride and Prejudice. Um, and sometimes they are uh, poked fun at for their reading habits, like Lydia and Kitty in Pride and Prejudice.
Mhm.
But you're right, we don't get that figure. I think part of it is because the narrator of all of her novels, who feels like the same narrator across the novels, but of course we could argue that it's not. Um, the narrator for me is a version of a character inside these novels. The narrator doesn't have embodiment like a character or like, a sort of physical delineation, but there are moments where the narrator draws attention to their own act of writing and authoring, and I think that becomes the stand-in. But you're absolutely right. Um, it feels like something that I wonder if she had continued writing, many, many more novels, would we have eventually gotten that or not?
Almost sort of a next step on progression, maybe.
Yeah.
One of the characters actually was about the progression of her novels. Do you see a progression in tone
Yeah.
as time passes and she changes as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mentioned that like for something like the narrative technique, free indirect discourse, you can absolutely watch it go from being kind of this word sounds a little judgmental, and I don't mean it to be so, a little more like rudimentary, like she's like testing it out, trying to figure out what she can do with it. But the time
Right.
she's using it in Emma, it is sophisticated and smart and complex. So I think narratively, we absolutely see her changing. I think we also see some tonal shifts. Um, After Pride and Prejudice, she famously wrote in one of her letters that the ending of Pride and Prejudice was too light and bright. Even she's aware that like maybe there should have been uh, a bit of a shadow in the novel, and she wonders about that. And Mansfield Park has a lot more shadows. Emma the shadows look very different than in Mansfield Park, but it also has more shadows. Persuasion is a bit shadowy. So I think she really is aware of and testing out different tonal possibilities.
Um, we actually had a question about Mansfield Park specifically. What do
Sure.
you think inspired her to write such a pious character as
Yeah.
Fanny Price?
Yeah. So I'm gonna just absolutely admit right now, Mansfield Park is my least favorite novel, and Fanny Price is my least favorite protagonist because I so my non-scholarly answer is I have absolutely no idea. And if I were her editor, I would have said, "Can we please revise this? This is not a heroine I feel like rooting for." Um, you know, Mansfield Park is largely recognized now as the novel where Austen most explicitly is taking up the conversations around slavery in the British Empire. Just even from the title, Mansfield was an important slavery-based judgment that happened at the time. There's a whole host of things inside the novel. So I think the somberness of Fanny Price partly is reflected in that tonal shift, which is a good tonal shift. One of the problems that a lot of us have to face is, sometimes it feels problematic that Jane Austen's novels don't recognize the complicated historical setting that they are in, right? Like I am always telling my students, every time you see someone in these novels having tea and taking sugar, like that sugar is uh not even just complicated. Like that sugar comes from a plantation. That sugar was produced by an enslaved individual, and Jane Austen knew that. Jane Austen was smart and savvy, and there's lots of evidence that she was an abolitionist. Her brother like served in that capacity. So um but yeah, so I think part of Mansfield Park is about her trying to grapple with some of the darker realities of England, and I think Fanny Price's uh, somberness as a protagonist embodies some of that. And I think that if Austen had been able to write for longer, she might have been able to write a more compelling protagonist and hopefully also consider the historical implications.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Unfortunately, I think we have time for just one more question. So we had a couple people ask about an entry point to Jane
Sure.
Austen,
Yeah.
people who had not read any of her work.
Yeah.
Which of those novels, those six
Sure.
novels, would you recommend as that
Sure.
entry point?
So I'm going to give two entry points. So I'd say one might be the obvious, which is Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is at the center of Austen mania now. That was Henry James's phrase, Austen mania. He actually meant it in a derogatory way. It was like
Oh.
Austen mania. I'm not here for this. But it was also at the center while she was publishing, right? So like so that is a and there's a reason. It's a really digestible story. It can feel very contemporary. And my advice with it is to um, enter the novel as if you are entering a slightly different language, because the way Austen writes her sentences, the length of her sentences and paragraphs, it feels foreign because it is a little bit like it is temporally foreign, and you got to stick with it. And then my second, maybe unsurprising entry point would be Emma. And I would actually say watch Clueless first and
Hmm.
then start reading Emma. I mean, always read the book first, most of the time. But I think with Austen, she's so part of our cultural zeitgeist. You don't have to follow those rules. And Clueless is really great at the social class dynamics. And I think having those in your brain in like 90s form might help as an entry point to Emma.
Excellent. Thank you. Um, I think it's about time to wrap up this Q&A. Thank you so much to Professor Cristina Griffin for sharing such an insightful look into Jane Austen's enduring popularity. It was great to celebrate this beloved author's birthday with you, and I hope that we will continue to enjoy and appreciate Austen's works for the next 250 years. To discover more lifetime learning content, please visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Thank you again, Professor Griffin, and thank you, audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.